Anya Mehta's body was discovered by apartment maintenance workers at 9:47 in the morning on March 17, 2024, lying on her bedroom floor in her modest Austin apartment near the University of Texas campus, with ligature marks around her neck indicating she had been strangled sometime during the previous evening, while the rest of the graduate student complex went about their ordinary routines, completely unaware that a brilliant young woman who had traveled 8,000 miles from Hyderabad to pursue her academic dreams was being murdered by the married professor who had systematically manipulated her through a secret relationship that began as mentorship but evolved into obsessive control ending in violence. When Anya finally recognized the exploitation and threatened to expose the affair that would destroy Professor David Campbell's carefully constructed reputation as distinguished academic and devoted family man. The scene that investigators encountered suggested a struggle had occurred, with furniture overturned and Anya's laptop smashed, as if someone had been desperately trying to destroy evidence of communications that might reveal the true nature of their relationship and the escalating conflict that had culminated in her murder when she refused to remain silent about abuse disguised as forbidden romance. The investigation that would eventually expose David Campbell as something far darker than the charismatic, beloved professor his colleagues and students knew began with routine questions about who might have had access to Anya's apartment and whether she had mentioned conflicts or threats in the days before her death, but quickly evolved into examination of power dynamics, psychological manipulation, and the particular vulnerabilities of international students far from home who could be exploited by authority figures who understood exactly how to weaponize isolation, ambition, and the desperate human need for connection and validation in unfamiliar environments where cultural differences and visa insecurity created additional pressures that predators recognized and exploited with calculated precision. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Austin Police Department immediately noted the defensive wounds on Anya's hands and the specific positioning of her body that suggested she had been murdered by someone she knew rather than a random intruder, and the absence of forced entry or robbery indicated the killer had been welcomed into her apartment before the confrontation that ended in her death. The relationship between Anya Mehta and Professor David Campbell had begun 18 months earlier in September 2022 when Anya enrolled in his advanced seminar on cognitive psychology, immediately impressing him with her insightful questions and sophisticated understanding of research methodology, despite being new to American academic culture and still adjusting to the particular expectations and communication styles that differed significantly from her undergraduate experience in India. David's initial interest appeared purely professional, as he offered additional office hours to help Anya navigate cultural and academic adjustments, recommending supplementary readings and inviting her to attend department colloquia where she could network with other faculty and graduate students, all seemingly appropriate mentorship that colleagues and department administrators would have no reason to question or investigate as anything other than a dedicated professor supporting a promising international student. The transformation from mentorship to inappropriate intimate relationship occurred gradually over several months, as David systematically blurred professional boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions, progressing from academic discussions to increasingly personal conversations about Anya's family pressures and her feelings of isolation so far from home, positioning himself as the only person who truly understood her intellectual ambitions and emotional needs in ways that her family and fellow students supposedly could not appreciate. The grooming tactics David employed were textbook examples of how authority figures exploited power differentials, beginning with excessive praise for Anya's intelligence and potential, creating sense of special connection through disclosure of his own supposedly similar struggles early in his career, and gradually introducing physical contact through seemingly innocent gestures that progressively escalated while testing her boundaries and willingness to accept intimacy that violated professional ethics and university policies, prohibiting romantic relationships between faculty and students they supervised or evaluated. The secret affair that developed by early 2023 represented everything Anya had been conditioned by romantic narratives to interpret as profound intellectual and spiritual connection, rather than recognizing it as systematic exploitation by someone who understood exactly which vulnerabilities to target in a young woman desperate for validation and belonging in an environment where she felt constantly under pressure to prove herself worthy of her scholarship and her family's enormous sacrifices to support her education abroad. David presented their relationship as transcendent love that could not be constrained by arbitrary professional ethics or his inconvenient marriage, which he characterized as emotionally dead arrangement he maintained only for his children's sake, while his true self could only be authentic with Anya, who alone understood his intellectual depth and emotional complexity that his wife supposedly could not appreciate or reciprocate. The isolation that David systematically imposed on Anya included subtle discouragement of her friendships with other students who might recognize the inappropriate nature of their relationship or encourage her to question dynamics that should have been obviously exploitative to anyone not emotionally invested in believing David's narrative that their connection was special rather than predatory. The control David exercised extended to monitoring Anya's social media, demanding she delete photographs or posts he deemed revealing too much about her personal life, and becoming jealous and accusatory when she mentioned casual interactions with male classmates. All classic abusive behaviors that Anya interpreted as evidence of how deeply he cared, rather than recognizing them as warning signs of dangerous possessiveness and need for absolute control that would eventually escalate to violence when she attempted to reclaim her autonomy. The turning point came in February 2024, when Anya learned that David had been conducting simultaneous inappropriate relationships with at least 2 other female graduate students, destroying her belief that their connection was unique spiritual bond rather than pattern of predatory behavior by someone who serially exploited his position to manipulate vulnerable young women. The devastation Anya experienced upon discovering David's systematic deception triggered her decision to distance herself from the relationship and to consider reporting his behavior to university authorities. Despite her fear of the professional and personal consequences such disclosure might bring, given the power differential between a tenured professor with institutional connections and an international student whose visa status and academic progress depended on faculty recommendations and departmental support. The threats that David made when Anya informed him she was ending their relationship and considering disclosure escalated from emotional manipulation about how reporting him would destroy his family and career to more explicit warnings about how difficult he could make her academic progress and visa situation if she chose to characterize their relationship as anything other than consensual romance between adults that had simply run its natural course. The journal entries that investigators would later recover from Anya's laptop documented her increasing fear as David's behavior became more erratic and threatening, including an incident where he had appeared at her apartment unannounced late at night, demanding they talk, and another where he had sent dozens of increasingly aggressive text messages when she did not respond immediately to his attempts to contact her after she stopped attending his office hours and began avoiding locations where they might encounter each other. The final confrontation that ended in Anya's murder occurred on the evening of March 16th when David arrived at her apartment, ostensibly to have a calm discussion about their relationship but actually intending to intimidate her into silence about his behavior through whatever means proved necessary to protect his reputation and position. The forensic evidence would later reveal that the fatal assault occurred after Anya refused to promise she would not report their relationship to university authorities, and after she showed David emails she had drafted to the department chair detailing his pattern of exploitation and manipulation, triggering rage in someone whose entire identity depended on maintaining his carefully constructed image as ethical professional, and whose narcissistic personality could not tolerate the exposure and consequences that Anya's disclosure would inevitably bring. The discovery of Anya Mehta's body by apartment maintenance workers Manuel Rodriguez and his supervisor James Chen occurred during a routine check, prompted by concerned neighbor complaints about unusual silence from an apartment where the tenant typically played music and could be heard studying at all hours, given her dedication to her graduate program and her cultural background that emphasized extraordinary academic achievement as pathway to success and family. Pride. The maintenance workers had initially assumed Anya might be away visiting friends or attending a conference, but the accumulation of newspapers outside her door and the strange smell that neighbors had begun noticing prompted them to use their master key to perform a wellness check that revealed the horrifying scene of a young woman who had been dead for approximately 12 to 15 hours based on the preliminary assessment by responding officers who immediately secured the scene and called for homicide detectives. The crime scene that Detective Sarah Martinez encountered upon her arrival at 10:23 that morning showed clear evidence of struggle and deliberate murder rather than accident or suicide, with furniture displaced, Anya's laptop screen cracked as if it had been thrown or struck repeatedly, and her phone missing entirely, despite the charger being plugged into the wall socket, suggesting someone had taken the device to prevent investigators from accessing communications that might identify the killer. The ligature marks on Anya's neck indicated she had been strangled manually rather than with any implement, requiring significant time and force that suggested personal rage rather than quick, impulsive killing, and the defensive wounds on her hands and arms documented that she had fought desperately for her life against someone stronger who had ultimately overpowered her through sustained violence. The initial investigation focused on identifying everyone who had access to Anya's apartment and who might have had motive to harm a graduate student, who colleagues and professors described as brilliant, dedicated, and well-liked, despite being somewhat reserved and private about her personal life in ways that now seemed potentially significant. If she had been concealing relationships or conflicts she felt unable to disclose to friends or family. The interviews with Anya's classmates revealed that she had seemed increasingly stressed and withdrawn in recent weeks, declining invitations to social gatherings and appearing distracted during seminars, though most attributed this behavior to typical graduate student pressure, rather than recognizing it as potential indication of serious personal crisis or danger. The contact with Anya's family in Hyderabad brought devastating news to her parents and older sister Priya, who had last spoken with Anya via video call 3 days before her death, when she had seemed tired but otherwise normal, according to their expectations for someone pursuing demanding graduate studies in a foreign country. Priya immediately expressed concern that something had been wrong with Anya for several months, based on subtle changes in her communication patterns and evasiveness when asked about her social life and relationships, though at the time Priya had attributed these changes to Anya's busy schedule and natural maturation, rather than recognizing them as potential signs that her sister was involved in a situation she felt unable to disclose to family, who had sacrificed enormously to support her American education. The examination of Anya's apartment revealed several items that seemed significant to investigators, including a journal hidden in her closet containing entries detailing her relationship with someone she referred to only by initials, numerous references to feeling trapped and confused about whether the relationship was genuine love or exploitation, and explicit descriptions of threats made when she attempted to establish boundaries or discuss ending the affair. The journal entries documented Anya's psychological journey from initial infatuation with someone she described as brilliant and understanding to growing recognition that the relationship dynamics were unhealthy and that she was being manipulated through tactics that psychology literature she had been reading for her coursework identified as classic patterns of abuse and coercive control. The forensic analysis of the laptop that had been partially destroyed revealed recoverable data, including email drafts, text message backups, and document files that provided crucial evidence about Anya's state of mind and her relationships in the weeks before her murder. The most significant discovery was a draft email to the university's Title IX office describing an inappropriate relationship with a faculty member who had abused his position to initiate and maintain a sexual relationship while using his institutional power to prevent her from seeking help or ending the affair, though the email had never been sent, and Anya's journal suggested she had been terrified of the consequences such disclosure might bring for both her academic progress and her family's pride in her achievements. The investigation into Anya's financial records and communications revealed no evidence of robbery or financial motive for her murder, with her modest bank accounts untouched and her few valuable possessions, including laptop and tablets, still in the apartment despite being obvious targets if robbery had been the motive. The absence of forced entry and the specific nature of the violence suggested this had been personal crime committed by someone Anya knew well enough to admit to her apartment voluntarily, someone who had reason to want her silenced, rather than someone seeking financial gain through theft or burglary that might coincidentally have escalated to murder. The canvassing of neighbors revealed that several residents had heard raised voices from Anya's apartment around 9:30 the previous evening, but had not been sufficiently concerned to investigate or call police, assuming it was typical domestic argument or loud television that would resolve without intervention. One neighbor reported seeing a man matching general description of a white male in his 40s, leaving the apartment building around 10:15, looking agitated, and walking quickly to a dark-colored sedan parked in the visitor section, though the witness had not been able to provide specific details about facial features or license plate that might have immediately identified the person. The discovery of security camera footage from the apartment complex parking area provided breakthrough evidence showing a vehicle arriving at 8:53 and departing at 10:17, with partial license plate visible that investigators would be able to trace once they developed suspects to compare against. The footage quality was insufficient to identify the driver clearly, but the vehicle type and color matched thousands of similar sedans in the Austin area, requiring investigators to develop other leads that would narrow the suspect pool before the surveillance footage could become definitively useful for establishing identity and timeline. The interview with Ethan Cole, a fellow graduate student who had been friendly with Anya and had noticed her increasing distress in recent weeks, provided crucial information about her concerns regarding a professor whose name she had not disclosed, but who Ethan believed had been making her uncomfortable through excessive attention and inappropriate personal questions during office hours. Ethan described Anya as having been conflicted about whether to report the professor's behavior, worried that making accusations against a tenured faculty member would be dismissed or would result in retaliation that could destroy her academic career and visa status, leaving her with no choice but to return to India, having failed to complete her degree despite her family's enormous investment in her education. The examination of Anya's university email account revealed extensive correspondence with Professor David Campbell, including messages that progressively became more personal and intimate over the 18-month period of their acquaintance, with early exchanges focused on academic matters gradually incorporating discussions of personal struggles, emotional needs, and eventually explicit romantic content that violated university policies and professional ethics governing faculty-student relationships. The email trail documented David's systematic grooming of Anya through excessive praise, offers of special opportunities and mentorship, and gradual escalation of boundary violations that culminated in explicit sexual relationship that continued for approximately 8 months before Anya attempted to end it in February 2024. The background investigation into Professor David Campbell revealed a distinguished academic career spanning 20 years, numerous published articles and books, consistent positive teaching evaluations, and reputation as dedicated mentor to graduate students, especially women and international students, whom he claimed to have special interest in supporting through the challenges of academic culture that could be difficult for those from underrepresented backgrounds. The initial interviews with Campbell's colleagues revealed no suspicions about inappropriate relationships, though several noted that he did seem to form particularly close mentoring relationships with certain female students in ways that might be considered boundary crossing, though never obviously unethical or reportable under university policies that were often ambiguous about what constituted appropriate versus inappropriate faculty-student interactions outside formal classroom settings. The formal interrogation of Professor David Campbell began at 2:30 in the afternoon on March 18th, less than 30 hours after Anya's body was discovered, when Detective Martinez and her partner arrived at his university office to ask routine questions about his relationship with the deceased student who had been enrolled in several of his courses over the past 18 months. David's initial demeanor was appropriately concerned and cooperative, expressing shock about Anya's death and describing her as a brilliant, promising student whose loss would be felt deeply by the entire department, though Martinez noted subtle signs of anxiety, including excessive hand movements, difficulty maintaining eye contact, and tendency to provide more detailed explanations than questions required, all potential indicators of someone who was guilty or hiding information about their relationship with the victim. The questioning that began as general inquiry about Anya's academic performance and social integration gradually became more focused as Martinez introduced information from recovered emails and journal entries that documented an inappropriate relationship between faculty member and student. Watching carefully for David's reaction and noting his immediate defensive posture an attempt to minimize the relationship as brief consensual romance between adults that had ended amicably several weeks earlier with no conflict, reason why anyone would want to harm Anya. David's version of events contradicted evidence investigators had already gathered from Anya's journal and email drafts, particularly regarding the consensual nature of the relationship and the circumstances of its ending that David characterized as mutual decision, whereas Anya's writings described her attempts to escape controlling relationship that had become psychologically damaging and professionally threatening. The timeline verification revealed significant discrepancies in David's account of his whereabouts on the evening of March 16th, with his initial claim that he had been home with his family contradicted by cell phone tower data showing his device had been in the vicinity of Anya's apartment between approximately 8:45 and 10:20, matching the window when security footage showed the suspicious vehicle arriving and departing from the complex. When confronted with this evidence, David changed his story to admit he had gone to Anya's apartment to have a conversation about their relationship, but claimed she had been alive and well when he left around 9:30, suggesting that someone else must have arrived after his departure and committed the murder that he had nothing to do with despite their complicated history. The forensic evidence that definitively connected David to Anya's murder included his DNA under her fingernails from where she had scratched him during the struggle, fibers from his clothing found on her body, and most damning, surveillance footage from a traffic camera showing his vehicle leaving the area at 10:17 rather than 9:30 as he had claimed, placing him at the scene during the time medical examiner estimated the murder had occurred based on body temperature and rigor mortis progression. The accumulation of physical evidence, combined with the contradictions in David's statements, provided probable cause for his arrest on charges of first-degree murder, though he continued insisting his innocence and claiming that any physical evidence could be explained by consensual, intimate encounter earlier in the evening before someone else arrived and killed Anya for reasons unknown. The search warrant executed at David Campbell's home revealed additional evidence, including scratches on his neck and arms that his wife had apparently not questioned, or that he had explained away as accident or encounter with their family dog, clothing matching fibers found at crime scene, and most significantly, Anya's missing cell phone hidden in his home office where he had apparently taken it after the murder to prevent investigators from accessing text messages and call logs that would document his threats and the true nature of their relationship in the days leading to her death. The phone's contents revealed dozens of increasingly desperate and threatening messages David had sent when Anya stopped responding to his attempts at contact, including explicit threats about destroying her academic career and visa status if she disclosed their relationship or characterized it as anything other than consensual romance that had simply not worked out. The interview with David's wife, Patricia Campbell, revealed a woman who had been completely unaware of her husband's affairs and whose image of him as devoted family man and ethical professional was shattered by the revelations about his relationship with Anya and the evidence suggesting he had murdered her to prevent exposure that would destroy everything he had built over 20 years of academic career. Patricia's shock appeared genuine as she described David as attentive husband and father, whose long hours at university she had attributed to dedication to research and teaching, rather than recognizing them as cover for inappropriate relationships with students he was supposed to be mentoring professionally, rather than exploiting sexually and emotionally. The investigation into David's history revealed that Anya was not his first inappropriate relationship with a student, with investigators identifying at least 3 other women who described similar patterns of excessive mentorship that had evolved into boundary violations and, in 2 cases, explicit sexual relationships that the women had been too intimidated or ashamed to report at the time they occurred. The pattern that emerged showed David as serial predator who specifically targeted vulnerable international students and first-generation college students whose isolation, visa insecurity, or family pressure made them particularly susceptible to manipulation by authority figure who promised special opportunities and support while actually exploiting their vulnerabilities for his own gratification and sense of power. The testimony from Dr. Karen Lewis, a colleague in the psychology department who had noticed David's patterns but had never reported them due to fear of retaliation and lack of concrete evidence that would convince administration to investigate a tenured professor with strong institutional connections, revealed the systemic failures that had enabled David's predatory behavior to continue for years. Karen described observing David form intense, exclusive relationships with certain female students, monopolizing their time and attention, discouraging them from working with other faculty, and creating dependency that went far beyond appropriate mentorship. Though she acknowledged that she had rationalized away her concerns, rather than taking action that might have protected subsequent victims, including Anya, whose death might have been prevented if earlier warning signs had been properly investigated and addressed. The university's Title IX investigation, that ran parallel to the criminal proceedings, revealed institutional failures in oversight of faculty-student relationships, inadequate training about recognizing and reporting boundary violations, and cultural factors that made students hesitant to report inappropriate behavior by powerful professors who controlled access to research opportunities, recommendation letters, and career advancement necessary for academic success. The investigation documented that Anya had confided in one faculty advisor about feeling uncomfortable with David's attention, but had been advised to be careful about making accusations that might damage her reputation and academic prospects, advice that reflected the institutional priorities that often protected faculty over students, especially when students were international or otherwise vulnerable to retaliation. The media coverage of David Campbell's arrest brought national attention to the case as example of how academic power dynamics enabled predatory behavior and how institutions often failed to protect vulnerable students from faculty members who exploited their positions for sexual gratification and psychological control. The coverage included interviews with former students who described their own experiences with boundary-crossing professors and the barriers they had faced in reporting inappropriate behavior to administrators who seemed more concerned about institutional reputation than student safety and well-being. The public reaction divided between those horrified by David's exploitation and murder of a vulnerable student and those who questioned whether Anya bore some responsibility for entering into relationship with married professor, reflecting broader cultural ambivalence about consent and responsibility in situations involving significant power differentials where the person with less power could be characterized as making choices while ignoring the coercive context that made genuine free choice impossible when employment, grades, recommendations, and visa status all depended on maintaining good relationship with person wielding power. The formal charging of Professor David Campbell with first-degree murder, sexual exploitation, and abuse of position occurred 3 days after his arrest when prosecutors presented evidence to grand jury that returned indictments on all charges, with the first-degree murder charge reflecting prosecutors' theory that David had killed Anya deliberately to prevent her from exposing their relationship and his pattern of predatory behavior that would have destroyed his career and family life. The additional charges related to abuse of his position to initiate and maintain sexual relationship with student he supervised, the charges that carried significant prison time independent of the murder charge, and that would ensure David faced consequences for his systematic exploitation, even if prosecutors somehow failed to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt required for conviction on the most serious charge. The bail hearing attracted intense media attention, as prosecutors argued that David posed flight risk and danger to potential witnesses, given that he had murdered Anya specifically to silence her testimony about his behavior, while defense attorneys claimed that David was a respected professor with deep community ties who deserved release pending trial with electronic monitoring and travel restrictions. Judge Maria Rodriguez ultimately denied bail after reviewing the forensic evidence and the testimony from former students who expressed fear that David might attempt to intimidate or harm them before they could testify about their own experiences with his predatory behavior, determining that public safety required David's continued detention despite his lack of prior criminal record and his professional accomplishments that defense presented as evidence of his character and ties to the community. The defense strategy that emerged through pretrial motions focused on attempting to exclude evidence about David's relationships with other students, arguing that such evidence was prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific question of whether he had murdered Anya, regardless of how inappropriate his professional conduct might have been in other contexts. The prosecution successfully argued that pattern evidence was essential for establishing motive and demonstrating that Anya's death was not an isolated incident, but rather culmination of systematic predatory behavior where David had learned that exploiting vulnerable students could be profitable and enjoyable until victims threatened to expose him, at which point violence became his method for protecting the reputation and lifestyle that depended on maintaining his carefully constructed image as ethical professional. The victim impact statement from Anya's family was read by her sister Priya, who had traveled from India to attend the proceedings and ensure that justice was pursued vigorously for a young woman whose dreams and potential had been destroyed by someone who should have been protecting and mentoring her, rather than exploiting and ultimately murdering her. Priya's statement described the devastating impact on their parents who had sacrificed enormously to provide Anya with opportunities for American education, their guilt about not recognizing warning signs in Anya's communications that she was in distress, and their determination that David face maximum punishment for betraying the trust that students and families placed in educational institutions and the faculty members who were supposed to facilitate learning rather than predation. The trial proceedings began in September 2024 with jury selection process that required careful screening for biases about faculty-student relationships, international students, and the question of whether women who entered into relationships with authority figures bore some responsibility for consequences of those relationships. The final jury included a diverse mix of community members who prosecutors and defense both believed could fairly evaluate evidence about power dynamics, coercion, and whether David's actions constituted murder or some lesser offense that might reflect heat of passion or accident rather than deliberate killing to silence someone who threatened his interests. The opening statements presented competing narratives about the relationship between David and Anya, with prosecution emphasizing the systematic grooming and exploitation of vulnerable student followed by murder when she attempted to reclaim autonomy and expose his predatory behavior, while defense portrayed the situation as consensual affair between adults that had ended badly when Anya became emotionally unstable and threatened to make false accusations, leading to tragic confrontation, where David had acted in self-defense when she attacked him, and he responded with force that unfortunately resulted in her death, but that had not been his intention or goal. The forensic evidence presentation dominated the early trial phase, with medical examiner testifying that Anya's injuries were inconsistent with self-defense scenario and instead indicated sustained assault by someone who had strangled her deliberately over a period of several minutes rather than a brief struggle that might have resulted in accidental death. The defensive wounds documented on Anya's body told story of desperate fight for survival against someone stronger who had ultimately overpowered her through sustained violence that required conscious choice to continue applying lethal force even as she struggled and fought to breathe, contradicting any claim that her death was accidental or result of brief struggle that had unintentionally escalated beyond what David had intended. The testimony from digital forensics experts revealed the complete contents of Anya's recovered phone, including the threatening messages David had sent, the journal entries describing her fear and confusion about the relationship, and the draft emails to university authorities that she had been working on but had not yet sent before David murdered her to prevent that disclosure. The evidence painted a picture of a young woman who had recognized she was being exploited and who had been gathering courage to report the abuse, despite understandable fear of the consequences such disclosure would bring for her academic career and family pride, ultimately losing her life, because she had finally decided that silence was no longer acceptable, even if speaking out came with significant personal cost. The testimony from other victims of David's predatory behavior provided devastating pattern evidence, establishing that Anya's experience was not unique misunderstanding, but rather example of systematic exploitation that David had practiced for years with multiple victims who shared similar vulnerabilities that he had learned to identify and exploit through his professional position and psychological training. The women who testified described remarkably similar patterns of grooming, isolation, boundary violation, and threats when they attempted to establish limits or end relationships, demonstrating that David was a practiced predator, whose murder of Anya represented escalation of violence that had been building throughout his career as his sense of impunity grew and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect his image intensified. The cross-examination of these witnesses by defense attorneys attempted to suggest they were motivated by revenge or financial interest in civil litigation, but the consistency of their accounts and the corroborating evidence from emails and text messages David had sent them made clear that their testimony reflected genuine experiences of exploitation rather than coordinated fabrication. designed to destroy innocent man who had simply made mistakes in judgment about appropriate professional boundaries that everyone violated occasionally, without necessarily being criminal predators deserving of murder conviction. The testimony from Anya's friends and classmates provided emotional context about how the relationship with David had changed her, with multiple witnesses describing how she had gradually become more anxious and withdrawn, how she had stopped participating in social activities and group study sessions, and how she had seemed trapped in situations she could not discuss openly, but that was clearly causing her significant distress. Ethan Cole's testimony was particularly impactful, as he described Anya's fears about reporting David's behavior and her belief that doing so would result in retaliation that would destroy her academic career and force her to return to India, having failed to complete her degree, despite her family's enormous sacrifices to support her education. The presentation of Anya's journal entries in her own handwriting provided the jury with direct insight into her psychological state and her understanding of the relationship dynamics, with entries progressing from initial excitement about the attention from prestigious professor to growing recognition that she was being manipulated and controlled, to final desperate entries where she described feeling trapped and afraid, but determined to end the relationship and report David's behavior regardless of the consequences. The journal revealed someone who had been intellectually sophisticated enough to recognize the exploitation while remaining emotionally vulnerable enough to struggle with leaving someone who had systematically conditioned her to believe she needed him and that she would be destroyed professionally if she disclosed their relationship to anyone who might help her escape. The testimony from Dr. Karen Lewis about her failure to report her suspicions about David's inappropriate relationships highlighted the institutional failures that had enabled his predatory behavior to continue for years without intervention. Karen's emotional admission that she had prioritized her own career security over student safety by remaining silent about patterns she had observed demonstrated how institutional cultures that prioritized reputation over accountability created environments where predators like David could operate with relative impunity, knowing that colleagues who suspected inappropriate behavior would hesitate to report without overwhelming evidence that might protect them from retaliation or accusations of making unfounded claims against respected colleague. The expert testimony about power dynamics in faculty-student relationships provided the jury with psychological framework for understanding how David had exploited his position to initiate and maintain relationship that could not be genuinely consensual, given the extreme power differential and Anya's dependence on him for grades, recommendations, research opportunities, and general navigation of academic culture that international students found particularly challenging. The expert witness testified that students in Anya's position existed in state of continuous vulnerability where saying no to professor could have devastating academic and immigration consequences, making genuine free choice impossible even if students believed they were making autonomous decisions about relationships that felt special or meaningful. The closing argument synthesized weeks of testimony into competing narratives about responsibility, consent, and whether David's actions constituted deliberate murder or tragic accident resulting from relationship that had become complicated and volatile. Prosecution emphasized the forensic evidence of sustained strangulation, the threatening messages David had sent when Anya attempted to end the relationship, and the pattern of predatory behavior with other students that demonstrated his consciousness of guilt and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect his reputation and position when victims threatened to expose him. Defense closing arguments attempted to generate reasonable doubt by suggesting that the physical evidence could be consistent with struggle that had escalated unintentionally rather than deliberate murder, that Anya's journal entries showed she was an emotionally unstable person whose accusations might not be reliable, and that David had loved her genuinely, but had been driven to desperate action when she threatened to destroy his life through false accusations of coercion and exploitation. The victim-blaming elements of this defense strategy were obvious to many observers, including several jurors who later described being offended by attempts to blame Anya for her own murder through suggestions that she bore responsibility for entering relationship or for threatening to expose it to authorities who might hold David accountable for his violations of professional ethics. The jury deliberation extended over 4 days, as 12 community members wrestled with questions about power, consent, premeditation, and whether the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that David had murdered Anya deliberately rather than killing her accidentally during confrontation that had escalated beyond what either party intended or anticipated. The length of deliberation reflected both the complexity of evidence and the serious consequences of their verdict for David, who faced life imprisonment if convicted of first-degree murder versus potentially shorter sentence if convicted of lesser charge, acknowledging some degree of accident or provocation that might mitigate his culpability, though not excuse his actions entirely. The verdict announcement on October 23, 2024, brought hushed courtroom to complete silence as jury foremen stood to deliver decision that would determine whether David Campbell would spend rest of his life imprisoned for murder of student he had systematically exploited and ultimately killed to prevent exposure of his predatory behavior. The reading of guilty on first-degree murder charges, along with convictions on all related counts of sexual exploitation and abuse of position, brought immediate emotional reaction from Anya's family and supporters, while David showed no visible response beyond slight trembling of his hands, as reality of his convictions settled over someone whose narcissistic personality had apparently convinced him that he would escape accountability through charm, manipulation, and victim blaming that had worked throughout his career, but had finally failed when confronted with overwhelming forensic evidence and testimony from multiple victims, establishing undeniable pattern of predatory behavior. The sentencing phase included victim impact statements that provided devastating accounts of harm David had inflicted not only on Anya, but on her entire family, whose dreams had been destroyed by someone who should have been protecting their daughter, rather than exploiting and murdering her to prevent exposure of systematic abuse disguised as mentorship and romance. Priya's statement emphasized that David had stolen not only Anya's life, but also her family's pride and hope for her future, their ability to ever trust educational institutions again, and their fundamental sense that world was a safe place where authority figures could be trusted to act with integrity rather than predatory self-interest that prioritized personal gratification over student welfare and safety. The sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole reflected the severity of David's crimes and the aggravating factors including abuse of position, betrayal of trust, murder to prevent exposure, and complete lack of remorse, demonstrated through his continued attempts to blame Anya for her own death. Judge Rodriguez's statement accompanying sentence condemned David's exploitation of vulnerable student and his violation of sacred trust that should exist between educators and those they teach, noting that his actions had damaged not only his direct victims, but also broader educational system, by making students and families question whether they could trust faculty members who held enormous power over academic futures, professional prospects. The immediate termination of David's university employment and revocation of his tenure represented institutional accountability, though many critics argued these consequences came far too late after years of warning signs that had been ignored or dismissed by administrators more concerned about reputation than student safety. The university's commitment to implementing comprehensive reforms, including mandatory training about power dynamics, enhanced oversight of faculty-student interactions, and clear reporting mechanisms for inappropriate behavior, represented an attempt to prevent future tragedies. Though skeptics questioned whether institutional culture could truly change without more fundamental transformation of power, structures that enabled and protected predatory behavior. The civil lawsuits filed by Anya's family against both David Campbell and the University of Texas sought financial compensation for wrongful death and for institutional negligence that had enabled David's predatory behavior to continue despite warning signs that should have triggered investigation and intervention before his violence escalated to murder. The settlements eventually reached provided substantial financial awards while avoiding lengthy litigation that would have required family to relive trauma through years of legal proceedings, though the symbolic importance of institutional accountability exceeded the practical value of monetary compensation that could never restore what had been stolen. The advocacy work that emerged from Anya's case included comprehensive reforms to how universities handle faculty-student relationships, enhanced protections for international students whose visa status makes them particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and mandatory reporting requirements for colleagues who observe boundary violations that might indicate predatory behavior, requiring investigation before escalating to serious harm. The reforms represented recognition that protecting students required institutional commitment to prioritizing their safety over faculty, reputation, or university image, fundamentally shifting power dynamics that had historically favored those with institutional authority over those seeking education and mentorship. The Anya Mehta Memorial Scholarship, established at the University of Texas, provided funding for international students pursuing psychology degrees, creating positive legacy from tragic death, while also ensuring that Anya's name would be associated with the academic excellence and potential she had represented, rather than only with the violence that had ended her life. The scholarship selection criteria emphasized supporting students from underrepresented backgrounds who demonstrated both academic merit and commitment to ethical practice in psychology, reflecting Anya's own values and the future she had been pursuing before. David Campbell destroyed everything through his predatory exploitation and ultimate violence. The legislative changes inspired by Anya's case included enhanced criminal penalties for educators who exploited their positions to initiate sexual relationships with students they supervised or evaluated, removing ambiguity about whether such relationships could ever be truly consensual, given the inherent power differentials and the professional ethics violations they represented. The laws classified such exploitation as criminal offense, independent of whether physical violence occurred, recognizing that psychological manipulation and abuse of authority constituted serious harm, deserving criminal accountability, rather than merely professional discipline through university administrative processes. The media coverage of David Campbell's conviction brought sustained attention to the phenomenon of faculty predators who exploited their positions to target vulnerable students, highlighting the particular risks faced by international students whose isolation, cultural differences, and visa insecurity made them especially susceptible to manipulation by authority figures who promised mentorship and support while actually pursuing sexual gratification and psychological control. The coverage challenged romantic narratives about professor-student relationships that popular culture had sometimes glamorized, emphasizing instead the inherent exploitation and harm such relationships caused, regardless of whether participants initially believed their connections were genuine or special. The support networks that developed among David's victims provided crucial mutual assistance as they processed trauma and worked toward recovery from exploitation that had left lasting psychological damage, including difficulty trusting authority figures, shame about being deceived, and ongoing struggles with intimate relationships where power dynamics triggered memories of manipulation and control they had experienced. The shared recognition that their victimization reflected David's systematic predatory behavior rather than their own failings or poor judgment helped reduce the shame that might otherwise have isolated them and prevented them from accessing therapeutic support necessary for healing. The professional consequences for colleagues who had suspected David's inappropriate behavior but had failed to report it included mandatory ethics training and formal reprimands for those whose silence had enabled continued victimization of vulnerable students. The institutional response reflected recognition that protecting predators through silence or willful ignorance constituted ethical violation requiring accountability. Though some critics argued that punishing individual colleagues while maintaining broader institutional cultures that discouraged reporting represented inadequate response to systemic problems requiring more fundamental transformation. The ongoing psychological research into why intelligent, educated women could be exploited by predatory professors contributed to enhanced understanding that victimization reflected sophisticated manipulation techniques, specifically designed to exploit normal human needs for mentorship, validation, and belonging, rather than indicating any deficiency in victims' judgment or intelligence. The research emphasized that power differentials made genuine consent impossible in faculty-student relationships, regardless of whether students believed they were making autonomous choices, validating legal and ethical prohibitions on such relationships, even when participants insisted their connections were special or consensual. The training programs developed for faculty members emphasized recognizing and maintaining appropriate boundaries, understanding how power dynamics affected student behavior and decision-making, and creating safe reporting mechanisms for students who experienced or observed inappropriate conduct. The programs included specific guidance about international students' particular vulnerabilities and the heightened responsibility faculty bore to avoid exploitation of individuals whose cultural backgrounds, language barriers, and visa concerns made them less likely to recognize or report boundary violations that American students might more readily identify as inappropriate. The relationship that Priya Mehta developed with other families who had lost children to violence at educational institutions provided her with community of understanding and support as she processed grief that was complicated by rage, the institutional failures that had enabled Anya's murder, and by guilt about not recognizing warning signs in her sister's communications that she had been in distress and danger. The mutual support among families who had experienced similar losses helped sustain Priya through the darkest periods of grief, while also channeling her pain into advocacy work that might prevent future families from experiencing comparable devastation. The international attention to Anya's case prompted examination of how universities worldwide handled faculty misconduct and protected vulnerable students from predatory behavior, revealing that similar patterns of exploitation and institutional failure existed across many countries and educational systems. The global conversation about academic power dynamics and sexual exploitation contributed to enhanced awareness and reform efforts that transcended national boundaries, though significant challenges remained in fundamentally transforming institutional cultures that had historically protected faculty privilege over student safety. The lasting impact of Anya Mehta's story continues resonating through the thousands of students who have benefited from enhanced protections and reporting mechanisms implemented in response to her murder, the faculty members who have received training helping them recognize and avoid boundary violations, and the administrators who have been held accountable for failing to investigate warning signs or protect vulnerable students from predatory colleagues. Her case serves as permanent reminder that academic authority carries profound responsibility and that violations of that trust through exploitation and violence deserve the most severe criminal penalties and institutional consequences. The memory of Anya Mehta, as brilliant, promising young woman whose potential was destroyed by someone who should have been nurturing her academic development rather than exploiting her vulnerabilities, lives on through the scholarship, bearing her name, the policy reforms inspired by her case, and the enhanced protections now available to international students who continue pursuing educational opportunities in foreign countries, despite the risks that cases like hers so tragically illustrate. Her legacy emphasizes that victims of exploitation and violence bear no responsibility for crimes committed against them by predators who weaponized institutional power and psychological manipulation to facilitate abuse, and that creating safer educational environments requires ongoing vigilance, institutional accountability, and cultural transformation that prioritizes student welfare over protecting faculty, reputation, or university image, regardless of how distinguished or accomplished those faculty members might appear to colleagues and administrators have not witnessed their predatory behavior. The enduring message from Anya's case emphasizes that power without accountability enables predation, that silence about suspected misconduct makes everyone complicit in subsequent victimization, that international students deserve enhanced protection rather than being targeted for exploitation due to their vulnerabilities, and that educational institutions must fundamentally transform cultures that have historically valued faculty privilege over student safety if they hope to prevent future tragedies where promising young lives are destroyed by those entrusted with their education and professional development. Her story stands as testimony to both the devastating harm predatory professors can inflict and the possibility of transforming personal tragedy into systemic change that protects future generations of students from experiencing similar exploitation and violence at the hands of authority figures who betray the sacred trust that should define educational relationships built on genuine mentorship rather than predatory manipulation and control.